A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I seek refuge in Allah from the outcast shaitan. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious and most merciful. Salamun alaikum, dear Muslim believers. Many traditional Muslims claiming that the Quran was receiving the same transmission process as the Hadith literature. This type of question has two problems because it is based on two different assumptions. The first assumption is that the Prophet was not able to read and write. Therefore, it was very difficult for the Quran to be compiled during the lifetime of the Prophet. The second assumption is that they believe the Quran was compiled later after the death of Prophet. Both assumptions are wrong according to the Quran. The Prophet was able to read and write according to the Quran. In chapter number 16, verse number 98, God says, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ When you read the Quran, seek refuge with God from Satan the outcast. God tells the Prophet, when you read the Quran, so the Prophet was able to read and write. It is mentioned in chapter number 96, verse number 4, God says, He who taught you by the pen. So the assumption that the Prophet was not able to read and write is very common among the traditional Muslim. But according to the Quran, the Prophet was able to read and write. Traditional Muslims also say that the Arabic word ummi means that the Prophet was illiterate. They claim that the Arabic word ummi means illiterate, and this is also incorrect. The Arabic word ummi, according to the Quran, means Gentile. One who does not or has no knowledge of the previous scripture. So because it is mentioned in chapter number 2, verse number 78, God says, and among them they are ummiyun, Gentile, that do not know the scripture. So the word ummi means Gentile, one who does not or has no knowledge of the previous scripture. So the idea of the traditional Muslims or assumption claiming that the Prophet was not able to read and write has no Quranic basis whatsoever. The Prophet was able to read and write according to the Quran. He was a Gentile. He did not have any knowledge of the previous scripture. The second assumption made by traditional Muslims is that the Quran was compiled later after the death of Prophet, and this is also incorrect. In chapter number 75, Surah Al-Qiyamah, verse number 16 to 19, we will see that the compilation process was happened during the lifetime of the Prophet. It means that the Prophet, when he died, the Quran was compiled, completed. In chapter number 75, Surah Al-Qiyamah, verse number 16 to 19, God says, La tuharrik bihi lisanaka litajala bihi inna alayna jam'ahu wa qur'ana. Do not move your tongue with it, to hurry on with it. Upon us it is collection and its recitation. Then when we have recited it, follow its recitation. Then upon us its explanation. So according to these verses, God is telling the Prophet not to worry about the recitation process, telling the Prophet, do not worry, we will gather the Quran, we will compile this. This indicates that the Quranic revelation was compiled during the lifetime of the Prophet. It is very clear. He was able to read and write, so it was compiled during his lifetime. So when the Prophet died, the Quran was complete. This makes perfect sense. How can a prophet of God, how can a messenger of God leave this world, and yet there is no message left behind? Therefore, the Quran clearly tells us the Prophet was able to read and write, and the Quranic revelation was compiled during the lifetime of the Prophet. Inshallah, we'll see you next time. Salamun alaikum.